I hope that I don't further mystify, but it is a theoretical talk, not so abstract. This was my charge, is to say something about how participatory governance came about, particularly in the field of political science, public administration, and actually international relations has turned strongly to governance. So my goal is to introduce these concepts and to the role that it could play in cultural policy. Before taking up participatory governance, I'm very bad at this, but I do my best. I always forget the whole thing. Before taking up participatory governance, we need first to examine the broader concept of governance of which it's a part. The word governance, it should be said, is used by different people in different ways, both casually and formally. But serious students of governance, for them, they can agree on several key elements. The decentralization of decision-making and increased involvement by non-state actors, and the emergence of new modes of steering by central authorities. The so-called new governance, many elements of which are not really so new anymore, rapidly emerged during the last few decades and swept across political science and public administration. Further, it has been widely adopted as good practice, promoted by an extensive range of governmental and non-governmental organizations, including the World Bank and the European Union. Why did it emerge? This is a complicated question, but key to it has been a changing political landscape, increasingly evident since the 1990s, including events like the collapse of Eastern European communism and a turn to civil society and a dramatic expansion of NGOs. One can identify here the increased influence of globalization and transnational organizations, global markets in particular, a proliferation of national and international NGOs, and a growing reliance on technical experts given the complexities of modern problems, all of which have overloaded central states with demands, political and social. The basic idea has been driven by the fact that governments, particularly central governments, are not working well, reflected in mounting unresolved problems, but also worries about democratic deficits, a crisis of representative democracy, and the fact that citizens seem rather disaffected and participation is low. Theorists of governance have spoken of the hollowing out of the state in terms of both functions and political legitimacy. This is an interesting side dimension because in the early phase of governance, leading writers thought that the state would disappear, if you could somehow conceive of that. But that was the idea, that governance arrangements would just move in and the central government would become relevant. Of course, this didn't happen, but there is a lot of governance that operates in the shadow of the state or in conjunction with it. And It's interesting to note that many people thought in the beginning or offered the European Union as an example. It has a very weak state, so it has many governance arrangements that have emerged to take care of the necessary business. Governance. So governance is about the promotion of a new political culture anchored to civil society and designed to deal with the changing boundaries between public, private, and voluntary sectors in relation to the changing role of the state. Governance as such emerged in the academic world as a name to give to evolving activities that often otherwise seemed disparate and at times unassociated. But lots of things were going on, and governance became the word to capture them. It captures the increasing role of citizens, civil society communities, non-state actors, markets, and third sector hybrid organizations in the political decision-making processes. The changes in the political landscape have resulted in the formation of governance networks in the various policy fields, or actually network governance, which became the dominant formulation. Network governance theory emphasizes polycentric networks of interrelationships that blur the boundaries among actors in public, private, and third-party sectors. These horizontal networks of policy-relevant actors are seen to better confront the cross-cutting complexities of policy problems. Network-based forms of decision-making in which the mechanisms of coordination and resource mobilization take place outside of hierarchical control are seen to offer new organizational capacities that can overcome the limitations of the anarchic marketplace and the top-down planning of the government in an increasingly complex global world. To quote Rhodes and Hertier, in a highly complex society with problems extending across borders, central actors are unable to muster the knowledge required to shape effective instruments of intervention. They thus must depend on the expertise and knowledge of private and local actors, as centralized and hierarchical steering is doomed to fail. So they argued at that time, actually not so long ago. The emphasis is placed on local actors because central experts are too far removed from the problems to adequately understand them, because local deliberation is often seen as more effective for finding innovative solutions to problems, because decentralized decision processes contribute to transparency and accountability, as less powerful social groups gain easier access to decision-making, and because decisions made as close as possible to local actors are seen to build local democracy. In contrast to traditional bureaucratic government, then government versus governance, then the concept of governance seeks to capture a culture of practices that brings together the decentralized engagement of citizens, organized civil society groups, non-state actors, and businesses with government agencies in the development and implementation of public policy. Thus, the emphasis is on flexible networks at various levels of policymaking, the deliberative processes within these networks, and collaborative forms of policy expertise. In the process, lower level and transnational organizations have become semi-governmental or non-governmental organizations, including numerous expert networks, particularly concerned with things like standard setting, global standard setting. Turning to the role of expertise, the collaborative co-production of knowledge is designed to better confront the challenges of complexity. Leela mentioned co-production, and I will say more about that shortly. In this view, governments have to focus on more interdependent social actors to achieve their goals because of the increasing complexity of the problems they face. It's thus only through collaborative processes of inquiry across a network of alternative arrangements that bureaucratic rigidities can be overcome. There's a significant array of empirical contributions identified by governmental governance researchers, all of which would or could apply to cultural policy, specifically in terms of the capacity of communities to deal collectively with their problems, such as public security, upgrading infrastructure, environmental degradation, or cultural advancement. Network governance can create a sense of social and cultural togetherness. Research shows that such capacity building does exist in communities that engage in the practices of network governance. This is particularly the case in matters related to catastrophes, both natural and social. With regard to service delivery, a range of experiences illustrate that community participation can improve the efficient uses of resources and the effectiveness of program outcomes in the delivery of services, outcomes identified in both developed and developing worlds. This is particularly the case when issues require both cutting through red tape and getting services and resources more directly and quickly to citizens. Research further has shown that decisions made through the participation of community members, rather than unaccountable administrators or political elites, can provide less powerful groups, such as ethnic and cultural minorities, better chances of influencing both the distribution of resources and delivery of services. Governance practices in this regard can better combine program efficiency with social equity they can do it better than bureaucratic agencies. In terms of political representation and distribution of power, governance can ameliorate the failures of representative governance by adding transparency and accountability. Which brings me to participatory governance, which is a variant, which puts its emphasis on the questions of democratic politics, political representation, and power. It's also an approach for present purposes that would advance a more engaged form of cultural democracy. It does this by confronting politically the fact that in many policy areas, including cultural policy, networks are not necessarily democratic. Indeed, they are often not democratic, despite the democratic rhetoric that has frequently accompanied the network approach, which largely has gone on to be more functional, instrumental, and service-oriented. It's also important to say, in this regard, even when the participatory network approach the network approach talks about participation. All participation is not democratic. That's an important point. Networks can, for example, and are often captured by internal hierarchies of the networks themselves or established interest groups concerned with the policies. Anybody who's looked into NGOs knows this quite well. The promise didn't turn out to be so much the reality. Equally significant, on a deeper cultural level, it recognizes that participatory spaces are never neutral. Networks as deliberative spaces are culturally structured as well. They are filled with people who typically bring into these spaces the basic social and cultural understandings of the society generally. This is one of the things that makes it easy to get for them to be co-opted, because there are assumptions about who the important people are, and these assumptions end up facilitating a dominant role by such people. Or that men know more than women, and all those sorts of things. And this is often overlooked by people who study deliberative practices and just seek a body of principles, like who gets to speak and what follows what and so forth, sort of ignoring this underlayer that deeply influences how that plays out. So this requires a deeper understanding, engagement of social and cultural political culture. Participatory governance thus puts up front a more empowering form of governance that draws on the theories of participatory democracy, deliberative politics, forms of participatory citizen inquiry. Let's see what we've got here for you. It sees the need to move participatory forms of participatory citizen inquiry and the political and cultural experiences of civil society groups, particularly social movements. Further, from participatory democracy, it sees the need to move more participatory democracy out of the realm from political institutions to a broader conception of a participatory society as a whole. Further, participatory democracy situates itself within the politics of the liberal capitalist state and the local struggles to which it gives rise, struggles concerning self-determination and inequality in particular. So I would say a basic thing that distinguishes participatory governance from old governance is, or I would actually say mainstream governance, is this focus on participatory democracy. It relates itself to that body of work, that theoretical orientation. So, with regard to local struggles, activists have used these participatory spaces to assist excluded peoples such as the poor, women, AIDS victims, the disabled, and ethnic groups in developing a collective socio-cultural presence that has permitted them to speak for themselves. Fundamental here is an emphasis on the deliberative empowerment of citizens. Participatory governance as such confronts a key question related to participation generally. While many are for more deliberation, although not everybody, the tough questions revolve around issues of complexity and competence. Contemporary policy questions are complex, and the degree to which citizens can meaningfully contribute to the process is, one has to be honest, open to discussion. Some writers write off this possibility as some form of idealism promoted mainly by leftists, but many policy experts have trouble with these complex issues themselves. And so they would ask, how can one seriously think that citizens can rise to the occasion, or at least most of them? In response to this challenge, Participatory governance bases its efforts on works showing that participation, that while it's difficult, it can work when deliberative processes are carefully thought through in advance. And there's a body of experience here to draw on from citizen juries, consensus conferences, deliberative polling, and participatory budgeting, among other things, that have all grappled with this question. In response to this challenge, participatory governance bases its efforts, an important dimension of this effort to facilitate such processes is a collaborative role on the part of experts in assisting citizens to deliberate and decide issues. Indeed, these projects have often given rise to a new kind of expert, a deliberative expert, one who cooperates, who works cooperatively with citizens to solve problems at hand. Such a role as facilitator is not only to uncover the factual relationships for consideration, which is the conventional role, the standard role, but also to connect them to the underlying normative implications of the facts and draw out the questions of what they mean for action-oriented decisions. Working to represent and serve the needs of citizens, in particularly marginalized or excluded citizens, this new breed, as it's been called, this new breed of public service is often schooled in non-governmental organizations. As government officials or independent consultants to parallel institutions, they've often played an essential role in the development and spread of participatory governance practices. The experiences of this new kind of expert have, moreover, given rise to an alternative professional orientation that challenges the standard techno-bureaucratic approaches of the modern state. These practitioners, here's a kind of summary of governance in general. These practitioners, along with their respective theoretical thinkers, have sought to reconceptualize the role of the public servant as a facilitator of public engagement. Feldman and Caterman, for example, have reconceptualized the role of the public manager as that of creating communities of participation. In their view, the challenge confronting governance is to interactively combine knowledge and perspectives from three separate domains of knowing: the technical, the political, and the local, or they call it local experiential domains. This, in short, brings about more inclusive practices of governance by inventing participatory contexts in which the representatives of these forms of knowing can discursively share their perspectives in the common pursuit of problem solving. Beyond merely identifying and disseminating information from the various modes of understanding and analyzing problems, such work involves translating ideas in ways that facilitate mutual understanding and deliberation among participants. It discursively promotes a synthesis of perspectives that helps to simulate different ways of knowing relevant to the problem at hand. In many cases, such collaborative expertise involves the development of citizen expert alliances and the uses of practices such as community-based participatory research, efforts that have taken their lead or drawn heavily on the work of Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire and his followers. The methods they put forth involve professional experts helping lay participants conduct their own inquiry on problems of concern to local residents. While there's been important efforts to facilitate this relationship, there are a number of problems that still need to be dealt with. Perhaps most important is the fact that professionals are not trained to facilitate participation. And many, maybe most, don't believe there's any point to engaging citizens in such activities. The successful efforts, more often than not, are the result of activities engaged in by professionals involved with progressive social movements of one sort or another. In addition, they raise difficult but important epistemological questions related to the nature of such knowledge. Does it just involve a division of labor organized around a traditional separation of empirical analysis and normative discussion? Or does it require involve a new hybrid form of knowledge, something in which the two are inherently fused, and including a role for local knowledge, local lay knowledge? Okay, available for such collaborative expertise is an alternative mode of inquiry called deliberative policy analysis. It's based on the view that the standard conception of rationality guiding decision-making is too narrow to adequately grasp local and public problems. In this view, policymaking requires more voices rather than fewer. This is especially the case in today's world of so-called messy or wicked governance problems, where the nature of the problem itself, let alone the solution, is not well understood. The methodological challenge involves the need to develop an analytical deliberative method capable of bringing together citizens and experts. This perspective recognizes that the normative elements lodged in the construction of empirical policy research rest on interpretive judgments that also need to be made accessible for examination and discussion, where the experts are not privileged when dealing with this normative dimension. They themselves are just citizens. The goal is still to gather technical information, but to place it within the social, cultural, and ideological context which give it public meaning. This need not mean political advocacy for positions, which is often a critique of this view. Rather than advancing particular social and political judgments, experts can lay out the implications of competing positions, to map out the implications of findings. The famous philosopher John Dewey pointed to that, something similar to that in the 1920s. So, the deliberative policy expert is a facilitator of citizen learning. This involves a pedagogical understanding of the sociocultural conditions of genuine learning, in particular as they pertain to the design and facilitation of learning environments for politicians, policymakers, and citizens. In short, experts would need to take on additional tasks of becoming experts on how social actors, citizens, politicians, and experts learn, how they clarify and make decisions in different cultures of knowing. So, I have, yes, I'm really quite worried about time because the other day I gave a short version of this, and I tried to convince the conveners here that I take some of this out, but I didn't get away with it. So just let me know when I'm fine. Really? Okay. So I have two examples to make this more concrete. One comes from Brazil, which we've already heard about, and the other comes from Thailand, and both are related to cultural policymaking, or have been. These projects, well, let's see, what do we have here? Here's a picture from Brazil. Perhaps the most famous example of participatory governance is public budgeting, developed in Brazil, which spread around the world. I'll just say this briefly. In the state of Porto Alegre, long governed by a clientelist pattern of political patronage, the Progressive Workers' Party introduced in the 1980s a publicly accountable, bottom-up, participatory system of budgetary deliberations geared to local needs. This has involved the development of multi-level deliberative systems influenced at various levels along the way, with some background influence, again, by Mr. Freire. As a result, the city was divided into regions with a regional plenary assembly that meets twice a year to decide budgetary issues. City administrators, community groups, and other interested citizens attend these assemblies, jointly coordinated by municipal government and community delegates. With information about the previous year's budget made available to the municipal government, delegates are elected to work out the region's spending priorities. After these priorities are discussed and ratified at a second plenary assembly, the delegates then put them forward at a citywide participatory budgeting assembly, which meets to facilitate the citywide budget from these regional agendas. Following these consultations, the executive consolidates a final proposal for the city council, which accepts or amends the proposal. So, local budgets are thus determined, or parts of them are determined by deliberating citizens through participatory forms. These have included the funding of ongoing cultural projects in cities, such as museums, but also have specially targeted cultural activities of groups such as the elderly, Black, and indigenous ethnic groups. There's also something, I'm not going to talk about it, but I'll just mention it. I think I actually have a slide about it. They have something called the National Policy Conference, and they had the National Cultural Policy Conferences, which actually shows and speaks to a critique that always comes up. Yeah, but this is nice, but can it be scaled upward? And this moves from the bottom deliberative forms up to the national policy level, and has been shown to be quite effective in many cases. So my other case, which I spent a fair amount of time on the ground studying, comes from Thailand. Taking advantage of a constitutional provision calling for decentralized governmental structures, the city municipality of Khon Kaen initiated a well-developed process of urban participatory governance, which is what they called it. The approach was described by the mayor as a shift from working for the urban communities to working with them by allowing each community to play an autonomous role as a sub-municipality. In the process, the relations between the city municipality and the communities moved away from the earlier patron-client system to a participatory governance network that allowed local residents and administrators to collaborate in formulating and guiding their activities. Organized around the town meetings, the city's Division of Participation Promotion, which I found quite interesting, developed a deliberative process that brought together the mayor, local citizens, businessmen, and relevant interest groups to participate in formulating policy decisions. The actual deliberative processes is similar enough to what I described in about public budgeting. So I just want to jump to an extra dimension that deserves special attention. This is the engagement of a group of collaborative experts supporting the working groups of citizens. This has evolved a group of academics, mainly urban planners, from the local universities, who refer to themselves as a think tank to facilitate the deliberation with information and analysis, drawing on ideas learned from abroad, from their graduate studies abroad, in Europe in particular, but also in the United States. Here are some pictures of Konkane. These relate to the theory and practice of participatory governance, collaborative planning, and deliberative policy analysis. So actually what they did was they learned these ideas and they took them back home and they discussed this with the mayor, gave lectures about it, and they became this facilitating body. They also paid careful attention to the value conflicts surrounding the various policy issues, which would disrupt and bring about could bring an abrupt end to the process, including problems related to authoritarian practices that are not uncommon in Thai political culture, especially given the military regime in charge of the country as a whole. In many ways, they actually used this project as a sort of not so subtle way to speak back to the central government to say, we don't need you, we can do this ourselves, and we provide another model. And other parts of the country have tried to take this on. The planners collected and assembled relevant objective knowledge and information needed for effective policy decision-making, sometimes engaging in original research to better understand or clarify particular aspects of issues pertaining to the municipality. In particular, they examined and mapped out the relations of empirical problems to normative implications of competing decisions. And here are some citizens' maps that they worked out. The processes have demonstrated important successes that transcend the political gridlock that had often gripped the processes of municipal government there. Among the most prominent examples, and now I slowly come to an end, have been the development of disaster and emergency warning systems, particularly as they pertain to flooding and water drainage in a part of the world that suffers monsoons, but also, in addition to traffic problems, the development of cultural projects. Town meetings, for example, have led to the collaboration of organizing local festivals, the building of a city museum, the creation of pedestrian streets featuring cultural shows, shops selling local handmade crafts, and food from the region. Apart from that, the town meeting also contributed in the development of key symbols that represent the city's cultural identity. For example, such meetings led to the renovation of the city gate, a shrine, and the monument of the city's cultural hero. These initiatives were part of a larger effort to use local cultural capital to promote the city more generally. Citizens proposed that the municipality promote wooden Buddhist statues made by local folk artists, various souvenirs and gifts as gifts for visitors. City folk tales were also used to rename the streets after figures, characters in these tales. Further, the deliberative forums of culture brought about the creation of creative public spaces, including musical events. Participants, for example, proposed the idea of an annual music festival named after a famous local musical instrument. These initiatives were then linked to cultural tourism in the city, including the development of maps to assist both city residents and tourists to explore the projects and events. In addition, the deliberations succeeded in more generally, in establishing a common policy framework for determining and prioritizing the future of city development, including its cultural aspects. Promoting local cultural traditions became an integral part of the overall development strategy for the city. The cultural development for tourism became part of the effort to enhance the local economy. Okay, so a few brief conclusions. The topic is complex, but I hope I illustrated some potentials here of participatory governance for cultural policymaking. As examples of activities in Porto Alegre and Concain show, participatory governance has gained a prominent place on the political spectrum of participatory innovations. It's not the only one, but it's an important one. Promoting decentralized practices, it adds an additional layer of local participatory institutions to an increasingly complex institutional landscape that has in some cases given rise to the transfer of both resources and decision-making power. I should have also said the basic difference between old governance and participatory governance is that participatory governance puts its emphasis on not just deciding which alternatives are good, but defining the alternatives, that is, of setting the agenda. I would say that's the crucial distinction, that it is involved in the agenda as well as the subsequent deliberations. In addition to participatory governance contributions to democratic practices, it offers politicians and decision makers a different kind of knowledge to consider in their deliberations. But a couple of additional points need to be added. It tends to work best in countries that are based in significant part on consensus, places like Denmark or the Netherlands. In adversarial political cultures, like the one in the United States, I don't know if you've heard about our fate there, but it's very adversarial. Participatory governance is hard to find. It doesn't have a terrain for this. Governance in general, but participatory governance could be different. Which leads to an important caveat too often overlooked in the governance literature, namely governance is always about policy, and policy is always about politics. When a policy is highly politicized, governance offers no magic bullet. Participatory governance, in contrast to governance more generally, tries to address this reality head-on. Participatory governance is political. It focuses not just on the instrumental delivery of services, but first on the politics of policymaking and service delivery. It insists on setting these activities in their political context. So it makes governance political in the best sense of the term, participatory democracy in the public interest. So I think that's the end. That's my conclusion. I would say I would turn and ask you perhaps to think about the insights or lessons that might be drawn from or taken away from this concept and its practices, and particularly as it relates to the processes, activities and processes of cultural policy making. Thank you. Here is a list of reading that you could follow up on if you had some further interest.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Fischer. I hope this lecture was elaborate and inspiring and informative enough for all those questions and queries and doubts that were raised during the day on what participation is, how it relates to the points of democracy, culture policy, governance. I hope that they've found the sort of paths to better clarifications. But yes, we shall turn to questions. And if you can, again, introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very interesting and inspiring lecture. I came from the University of Zadar, and I'm a sociologist living and working in Croatia. And for some time I was living in the former Yugoslavia, which was officially named as a self-managing and self-governmental country. You know how it came out eventually. I mean, it was disastrous by the end of the 80s. Something that I wanted to ask you is perhaps indirectly connected with the context which I mentioned. Namely, how much do you remind the government or the classical government or the government in the shadow of military, financial today, is complementary to governance processes, especially to participatory governance. Well, just a short explanation. What we saw in the final scene in Yugoslavia, final episode of the government, of the self-government or self-management system, is that the central government, the fractions of the Communist Party didn't want to tolerate the activities of citizens, workers, and especially students for some time. Okay, so again, to explain the background of the question, how much to your mind, or is there any rule concerning this issue? Maybe complementary is, in other words, excuse me, tomorrow we will discuss about that, or at least to me when speaking about Croatia. Is this a zero-sum game, or is it possible a non-zero-sum game? More to governance, less to government. You see what I mean?
Yeah. As for rules and principles, there are no guarantees here. This is a project. It doesn't necessarily work easily. I argue that if the conditions aren't right, it's actually better not to do it. It'll fail. And people will say, see, we knew it, but there are enough experiences to show that it can work and have important important benefits. I am on uncertain soil here, but I think the collapse of Yugoslavia is not a good example of, because I mean there's so many conflicts, I mean all these conflicts that came out when, I don't know how to put it, but when the cover was lifted, it was an ugly affair. So it's better to think of this in local terms. I think it's relevant to many of the kind of things that I've heard about here. in regard to cultural activities, which are inherently local, where people who want to do something different come together. It doesn't work by just sort of randomly picking people. It comes together when particular people decide they want to do something differently in a participatory way. I would say it has a kind of organic dimension, and that the various projects look differently. I would only add one point, that I was studied also a similar process in India, and this was in Kerala, which was famous for its activities, but I focused on the participatory people's planning process, and the astonishing thing was that this was initiated by a government ruled by the Communist Party. Who would think of this? Although in India, being what it is, there's more than one Communist Party, and they don't seem to talk to each other. So this doesn't really speak to your case, but in my experience, it only really works if there are people at the top and people at the bottom who identify each other and agree to work. It can't just work from the top. If there are people at the top who try to impose this, it won't work. Unlikely. But it involves, therefore, activists at the bottom meeting somewhere with particular kinds of relative alternative sorts of bureaucrats or public officials who says, let's try something different, like the mayor in Konkan, or I could mention other examples, but from all the things that I've studied, I would say that is the most important consideration for success. If the top doesn't want it, it can only operate for a while, marginally, and usually dies out. And likewise, if only the top thinks about this, they can't do it from the center. So it requires, but this is a kind of model for sort of transformative politics. I argued that we have a democratic deficit. I mean, everybody knows this. And it can also be seen, these kinds of projects can be seen as ways to revitalize civil society elements that activate the kind of more local engagements that can make representative government work. Problem with representative government is it's not attached to anything local. We vote for these people and they go off and do this and that, and we don't really have any accountability or any connection to them. But participatory governance is a kind of project that could fill in this gap. This is an ideal, but it's an ideal with some practical examples. I would say that. I'm not sure it answered all of your...
It's working? Yeah. Adriano from the south of Italy. Everyone's tired, so I will cut it short. My question is about the relation between the neoliberal governance and this participatory governance. Actually, we see that the states are the vector to the enforcement of market rule, and also that there is this vertical centralization of decision-making to fast-track austerity, political economy, and so on. So the question is there an inherent danger in participatory governance to not tackle with the central government and the structure of...
Yes. This is a really crucial question. Governance, as opposed to participatory governance, has been highly criticized for being too close to the state, and some writers have argued that it's quite convenient for neoliberalism. Even in the UK, it's been argued that the devolution of the Great Society model is quite convenient to say, okay, we turn authority over to local level, but they don't get any resources. So then the central government say, well, you didn't, you can do it. but it's no longer our problem. That's a dangerous thing. In part, there's a very good book by a named Jonathan Davies about this, where he challenges the standard model of governance. And I would say that participatory governance emerges to recognize this and more fundamentally anchor the activities to the civil society and sort of reflectively decide when to engage and when not. But other traditional governments sort of embraced or got swallowed up, co-opted by governments, I would say. And it's really an important thing, and there's no fast rule. You have to sort of, the people on the ground have to think about this all the time and decide what the conditions and the possibilities are that they face.
Thanks, Prof, for your illuminating presentation. You made a statement that is not sitting well with me. You said all participation is not democratic.
Say.
All participation is not democratic.
Yeah.
Yes. If participation is not democratic, then it's repressive. And if it's repressive, there's no need to argue about participation. My take is that there are certain forms of participation that speak to democracy, to democratic governance. So much so that your statement, I think, needs to be qualified in terms of the different categories of participation, hence the need to argue for participation, because if it's not democratic, then it's repressive.
Yeah, well, that's actually, I think is my point. If I wasn't clear, I think, participation became something of an ideology as a solution for everything. There's a book about this called The Tyranny of Participation. I think they're too cynical, but what I mean is that you can have, for example, participatory management, where all the premises of the deliberation are determined by the managers, and then it's your job to figure out how to effectively make them work, problem solving or something. But it's only really democratic when the participants also can have a say, an influence on the agenda that's going to be discussed as well. That's the key distinction. Otherwise, one has to be careful about participation in general. It's not necessarily democratic. It could be co-opted for other people's purposes and things like this. But it can be, we can identify democratic forums. Did that speak to, I mean, I think we're actually in agreement, even if what I said originally didn't come across clearly enough. I hope so.
There is not any more questions? Oh, there is? Sorry. Give us a hand with the mic.
Thank you once again for a wonderful presentation. Just a short question. Could you please elaborate a bit more on some practical, actually, sides of participatory governance in terms of effective mobilizing local human and social capital, not just for the purpose of decision making, but perhaps for the purpose of putting additional efforts like volunteering in order to achieve some community goals? I don't know, but I presume that this example from Thailand was so successful, not just because people united in decision making, but perhaps they also put their work in it in order to achieve what has been done in terms of culture policies, but also creating a better promotion and cultural tourism, I think you mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it produced, it transformed the civic culture, and people saw this working and they wanted to become involved, and then they realized this is something good, and it spun off into a variety of different topics, and there was then a proliferation of policy topics for these participatory governance projects, and they also became kind of ambassadors for taking this information around to some degree. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak exactly, but it certainly did. I mean, the basic point is it did just what you're suggesting it could or might do, is that it had a dramatic transformation. But here again is a case that it worked because of a progressive, you could even say transformational mayor who was willing to do this, with citizens who wanted to play a role. There were demands for this, coupled by this academic group who stayed in the background but provided resources that sort of lifted the quality of the deliberations, because these topics were not simple, right? And they also helped the city's Department of Participation promotion. I mean, that already is a sign that something else was going on there. They helped them design the procedures for doing this, and also sort of reflectively altering them in other cases and things like that. And it was quite a moving thing, and an important thing given the political tensions in Thailand related to a military government that could sweep in at any time and say, forget this. You're going to take the orders from us, as you did before. That we will determine cultural policy, we will determine local transportation policy, we'll give you the money for it, but this is how you'll do it. So it was really dramatic. Yeah, I mean, it's still going on. It's still going on.
Right, so thank you again, Professor Fischer. If we have no other...
The timing is good because I'm finished.
Oh, we are well on timing. We just went 5 minutes over the line. Thanks, Professor Fischer. As I said again, thank you all for